Uh, thank you, Ned. Director Ashford actually, for me, crystallized a goal for our curriculum that you're going to help with, of which you are partners and players, when he said to focus on the planning process. And in point of fact, if we locked the door and said, okay, folks, design that planning process, I bet we would get it done in short order. That is, it's conceivable, we know how to do it, we can do it, and we will do it. And I think the goal of the curriculum, as you've seen it explained, is to get community spark plugs all present, but to get our neighbor, to get, as Director Ashford said, get the right people at the table. We know who they are, we know who the candidates are, we know who we have to encourage, mentor, and bring into the conversation. So all of this is conceivable. Nothing is impossible, and at least with your great help, we're going to get something on the plate for us to test, for you to help support. Ed and I and Katie have said by the end of this year, so stay tuned and thank you. One of these buttons is going to advance the case. So what I have and what you have in the handout is a thick dish. Too many slides to go through in the time to be reasonable, but it's a reference, and I think what I'm going to do is guide us through the reference, leave enough time for give and take, and then show you the design plan for not only this piece, what we're calling a module, but for the other modules. And the idea that we have, at least at the outset, is that this is a curriculum that we can bring through the RNN community program across country, that it's a set of modules that are, okay, they're PowerPoints, and before we have death by PowerPoints, we have to have some conversation. But the idea is that we would be able to have these modules understandable and usable by spark plugs in the community, that they would select ones particularly appropriate for their community, and that you'd have a workshop, ask participants to look at the material ahead of time as a sort of self-study, and come to the workshop not for stand and deliver, show and tell, but actually to engage. So we're thinking of this as background material, in some cases presented orally, in other cases worked on, shirt sleeves rolled up, and with some interactive exercises. So that's the plan. So as you fill out our evaluations and continue to communicate with us by email, think of that and give us suggestions of what works, what doesn't work, how we can make this right to reach that goal that we all share. So I'm going to go through the why, what, and how. And if you go to the YouTube and say, and look at how you give a TED Talk or how you engage a discussion, you go through the ritual of why we're doing this, what we're doing, and then how we're going to do it. So essentially the why part is the resilient communities, the Resilient Neighbors Network, to bring folks together to improve life safety, health, and well-being in their community by discourse and community shared action. And that sometimes gets lost in the disaster discussion, but we'll go through that a bit. And I'm going to begin with a little bit of the why. And just because there's so many good information here, a Resilient Neighbor Network, this is what the Resilient Neighbors represented in their documentation of the hazards that they are looking at. And if you look at all 10 communities, look at the second line in, it's all of them, and I think I'm missing some, so if there's an error here, it's my part. but all of the communities in the RNN network share flooding as a hazard, whether it's coastal, but it's mainly for this set inland or riverine. 4 listed in their documentation, drought is an issue. 4, not necessarily the same, listed heat as an issue. Now, what's interesting about the heat issue is there's very rare and unusual occasions when we have a heat disaster declared emergency, but that is now perceived as a threat by communities, and it's now recognized when you do a natural hazard mitigation plan. And when you have both drought and flooding together, what does that suggest? That suggests that maybe the problem on one side can become the solution on the other. If there's too much water here, how can we preserve, protect, and prepare ourselves for the drought? Those are new planning issues, and the techniques for doing it we're developing in place. There's no textbook that has this written down. There's no course material. But look at what is standard practice in each of our communities. Each of our communities have commissions on planning. They have planning and zoning. They have inland wetland commissions. They meet regularly. The laws and the rules are well defined. That's what we call muscle memory. It's all written in the habit. All we need to do is get those habits in the same place and the same time. It's a simplification to do all of your planning at the same time. It's a simplification to have all of your community outreach in the same fashion. So it isn't too difficult to think of that case, maybe 1 year from now, but certainly 2 and 3 years, when it's part of the muscle memory of my community that we meet quarterly and we combine and have a rational discussion, honest, straight on, about the risks and the steps we're taking to build community health, safety, and well-being. So that's where we're heading, and the RNN folks here are going to continue that conversation with us for the rest of the 2 days. And a lot of this material, here I am presenting this, preparing this material a month ago, but within the month, new stuff came up. So this slide was added 2 days ago. It just came across the screen. It's a report from the realty industry that looks at market values, whether property values have gone up or down compared to their analysis of multiple risks. Flood, fire, tornado, earthquake are included. And you'll see with the red where property values have decreased, and you'll see them directly correlated to the multiple risks experienced. Now, there's many reasons other than risk perception that would account for that property value decrease. So you need to go into, be careful about this, but on the other hand, in those areas with least risk, the property values have increased. So this is telling us something. Not yet headlines, you have to look at it carefully, but it does say that market appreciation, property values, investment opportunities are highest where there is lowest risk and in areas with mitigation programs. That's that headline in a report, and all my citations are in the paper you have. So those of us who are the scholars and have to do the paperwork, you'll have the references for what I'm referring to. So this is the what. I bet everyone in this room has been in a meeting as depicted on the right, and you'll see just to the left of the chief who's running the meeting, a young man who's nodding off. He had a late night the night before. I think some of us have been in these meetings where we do nod off. But these are important meetings. Now, what is typically the case, and I would argue that the natural hazard mitigation plan process is a place to start, is the local government is involved, the elected leadership is somewhat involved, the regulatory commissions are involved, the fire, police, public health are involved, and social and community services, very typically. And currently, the term Chief Resilient Officer is being developed as that person who is developing the skill set to combine, integrate, and combine. And again, this morning, I had across my screen a report from the Rockefeller Foundation saying, these are the characteristics of the Chief Resilient Officers, and I know you have one in Tulsa, I think funded by Rockefeller. They're actually, the Rockefeller Foundation is now reporting out lessons learned, so you'll see there this morning's the lessons learned about the qualities of the Chief Resilient Officer, and I think we're looking at some of you in the audience today. I show on the lower left the cover of a natural hazard mitigation plan developed by Milford, Connecticut, and they list all of the offices in the city offices that are related to that event that you see, which is Hurricane Sandy pounding the coast of Milford, Connecticut, essentially gobbling up houses and taking them into the Long Island Sound. There's not one city office that's not connected with that event. So all of a sudden we have to talk to one another, and we'll talk about how that is done. Now, often if we bring this to a public meeting, most of the people are looking for the exit. This is either too complicated, and actually you never motivate anyone to positive action by giving them bad news. So one of the challenges is, and it's the secret that's being conveyed to us, is let's start with the why. We're trying to combine our very best efforts, our shared commitment to economic prosperity, employment, educational and cultural options, municipal services, recreation, lifestyle, and the character of our community. Let's start there. And in fact, as I have done a scan, have I lost it? Oh, I'm still good. If I've done a scan of international programs promoting resilience, they may not use the word resilience. The mayor of Amsterdam did a tour of the East Coast. She stopped at most major cities to promote Amsterdam, her city. In the background was the threats that Amsterdam has faced for flooding, but not once did she use the word risk, disaster, hazard. And what she did promote were all of these values. And then I spoke to her afterwards, and she said, if I can get everyone committed to these values, we're going to be able to fulfill our natural hazard risk reduction program. So now we have come to the how, and someone in this audience is the author of these words, and I haven't got her permission to use them yet, but should she so acknowledge, I will use them. She sent in an email last week. What represents a national attitude about this is how do we inform and motivate individuals and communities with the data, analysis, and programs to take risk reduction action with the resources they probably don't have, that they otherwise are not inclined to take for events that they hope will never happen. Can I use that? Can I use your name? Yes, Christina says yes. So Christina is actually, this is a wonderful summary, I think, not only of where Christina is working, but of what most of us in natural hazard mitigation are facing as we walk out to the community meetings. So I'm going to be speaking about at least one wedge into the how, and that is the building departments, the conservation and development interests that are part of all of our state and municipal plans, whether we know it or not. There's folks involved, and just as if I need to figure out how this thing worked and what was the weak link when we couldn't get slides, I had to look at the wiring, I had to look at the bulb, the switches, I had to do network analysis to find the weakest link. I don't know what the weakest link was this morning, but there was a weak link. It might have been the battery in the little thing that was informing this little fellow. But in any system that works, in any network, there is a weak link. So part of our exercise, and I think at least my attitude is, if I can explain how building codes and zoning standards are created and implemented, then the community spark plugs will know where to enter the system, where to find the weak links, and where to put the patches. So part of this, what I'm presenting, is actually a little bit too much about planning and codes and zoning. I'll go quickly when I need to, but knowing that you can go back and look at the references. The group of folks who are normally around the table, not yet including the community, which may or may not be included in any particular case, is the building developer, the owner, architects and engineers who she or he may have hired, subject matter experts, which actually by law, a developer is required to have in order to represent all aspects of a project. And across the table in discussion at City Hall is the Planning and Zoning Department, the Building Permitting, Public Works. And the secret of moving forward, of getting to what Ed will talk about as win-win strategies, is to understand this discussion. And normally it's one of where the town may require of the developer to have spent a lot of money before coming before the authorities. So the developer may have already had to do engineering plans, spent money, fallen in love with the project, and have that much less leeway to talk about. And in many cases, presented to a community which ain't necessarily supportive. It might be a shopping plaza where there shouldn't be one, or where at least the community perceives there were one. So already it's written in the script that we're antagonists. And if we understand that if we can sit around the table and share mutual opportunities and obligations, there is a win-win strategy. So that's a little bit of why I'm showing this particular part of the wiring diagram. And at the bottom, you'll see 3 headlines that I wish you'll all know if you don't already know. They are win-win strategies. It's been proved that they lower the cost of construction. They return on the bottom line more quickly. And I think, as was mentioned today, over there, perhaps simultaneously in Tulsa, there's the building construction or the building owner are meeting. It would be wonderful to have a discussion with them to see where the win-win could occur, because that's how we make progress. So the argument of the whole community is that most citizens don't understand this at all. And if they have any chance, they'll show up to public hearing and throw rocks because they have a feeling that they don't like it. Whereas if, in fact, there is a community spark plug, if, in fact, there's a public-private dialogue, is there a role for that community spark plug? So you'll see it down on the right. Is that role currently simply information? We put it in a public notice, and if you want, you can go to the public works and look at the developer's plans, and if you want, you can show up at the hearing. Is it more than that? Is there someone presenting the case for public awareness and understanding, a rounded case? If it's a controversial case, there's probably conservation issues, safety issues, as well as economic development. Does the community have participation and buy-in? Are you getting volunteers at the table? Now, most public servants, many of you present, I know that when you leave a space on your desk, someone comes in and puts a file on top of it, so you keep your desk filled with files. I have found that in my work with municipalities, if I get to know those good public servants, my staff in engineering, my staff in inland wetlands, my staff in conservation, I can bring public sector volunteers to the table to help out. And I'm finding that in communities where that engagement of public sector staff with private sector representatives creates so much buy-in potential that it is the way forward for that planning process that Albert described this morning. So I'm going to take a little, I was asked to look at building codes. I could do a couple of hours on the history of building codes in this country, but I only want to mention a few. I show the water course, or the aqueduct, which, if you know San Antonio, it is actually a national monument because it's the oldest functioning aqueduct in North America. The system of water flow was brought by the Spanish. It was adopted by the Native Americans. It is extraordinarily ingenious. It operated by gravity, and it provided the water for agriculture in the Southwest, particularly in the Spanish colonies. And interesting is that that system was part of the public property, and every citizen had a role of its maintenance. So that was the common good to which I, whether I was a farmer or a townsperson, would help maintain it. Now, you'll see how that carries forward. I look at the Boston Building Code. Most building codes, history, if you look at the history of building codes, the work in fire codes is the most developed. And in this case, John Winthrop, governor of Boston, outlawed wooden chimneys and thatched roofs. And if you look at the text, there was a Jacob Thatcher who objected to this, but he inherited his family business of it, obviously, and his business was threatened by outlawing thatched roofs in Boston. But Thomas Jefferson, I mention him because he was one of many, Franklin was another, of our early meteorologists. They were amateur scientists, but interested in weather, among many other things. And Jefferson claimed, it's a wonderful story, cannot be proved, that the highest temperature in Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776 was 76 Fahrenheit. Now, he could have read that temperature almost anywhere. He could have found the place where that was the case, but it's a nice story. The reason I mention it is that's only 300 or so years ago. Now, and this too is new, this came across the screen July 6th. How many years later from 1776? A satellite placed in L1 orbit. I will explain what L1 is because I didn't know it and it was interesting to me. For the first time, taking one photograph of the entire side of the Earth in sunlight. All prior photos that we had of the Earth were composites. So L1 is the position in between Earth and Sun where the gravitational pull of each body is equal. So if I'm beyond that, I get pulled towards the Sun. If I'm closer, I get pulled towards the Earth. So that's a nice, stable orbit where there's a camera recording Earth's atmosphere, taking weather data down to vegetation and temperature every minute. So for the first time, just think, in 300 years, we have an ability to monitor our biosphere, the health of our planet, in an incredible level of detail. That's just another slide showing that. And if you go to the web, you can see these photos, and that object passing in front of us is the dark side of the moon. So you'll actually see the moon rotate around the Earth in this sequence. What do we learn from this? One of the results, and this is an astounding result. This too is part of July-August science reporting. From these images from various satellites, this image that shows the heat island effect in US cities, and you can see on the right, the hottest being the metropolitan districts. Oklahoma isn't in them, but the places where I live have this heat island effect. And what they are able to monitor is that areas covered in part by impervious surface, that's the heat island effect around heavily paved cities, is higher than adjacent suburban and rural areas. What difference does that make? A rise of each 1.8 Fahrenheit, 1 degree centigrade, raises US energy demands by air conditioning from 5 to 20%. It doesn't take much to say, what do we do about it? You'll all know the answer. It ain't that hard, really, once we realize it. So of all the events, and I'm sure someone in the room either was alive during the 1935 dust storm. Anybody here? Parents, yes, certainly, and therefore you know the stories. It's extraordinary. They said canvas just passed overhead. there was this dust cloud, particularly, it took many years, but there was one on Black Sunday that took several weeks to cross the country, but there was a Hugh Hammond Bennett testifying in Congress on behalf of what they had proposed as a soil conservation service. Congress was not necessarily for it, was all sorts of reasons why this and that should not be done. And Bennett knew that the dust cloud was coming, so he testified before Congress, knowing on the day that he was testifying that the dust cloud would arrive in Washington. And they dramatically opened the shades of the Congress where they're deliberating. He gave his testimony, and there he pointed to the dust cloud. The Soil Conservation Service was passed in Congress that week. It actually has endured until the present. In 1994, it was called the Natural Resource Conservation Service. It is the body of both research and practice that is supporting our national efforts for farmers and others to improve soil. It all started here, and there's even a more personal story for you folks. This is an extraordinary result. The Shelter Belt program, to me, amazes me. It was done under the FDR administration. It created a shelter belt from Canada to Texas. The first tree, the #1 shelter belt, is in southwest Oklahoma. The state forester, G. Phillips, planted the first tree in Willow, Oklahoma. Did anyone know this? This is new stuff. Maybe we should travel out to Willow. I'd like to see if that tree is still there. Is it the most important tree in Oklahoma? Stay tuned for the answer. Farmers were paid to plant and cultivate native trees along the fence, and this actually endured. Many parts of it fell into disrepair, but other parts are now being sustained and restored, depending on state, particularly around the Great Lakes. They're bringing back these plantings. And now, how many years later, we're talking about watershed resource. The word nexus is used frequently in the literature, meaning let's look at water, energy, waste, soil, and food, not as separate, but as part of the nature of living on the land and with nature. And of course, it's obvious. And so you'll see the results. There are extraordinary, as you see in the upper left, watershed restoration projects. These are very important. Our friends from Vermont, and Ned to be thanked, I think this is probably from your office, a state program for essentially watershed protection. And even down in the front yard of an urban dweller, a food garden. All of this you're seeing from national, state, to local as response to actually the preservation of life through conservation of nature without losing the need for economic investment and prosperity. So building codes, this can be boring. I know I'm happily joined by some architects here, so you remember having this in school, but a lot of people don't know, and I'm going to run through this. The building code process is open to each and every one of us. Now, you're not going to go into it, but a lot of architectural and engineering and construction professionals are volunteers and go to both state building code meetings and national building code meetings that build up to what is actually every 3 years an update of the ICC International Code. That code now has overridden most of what 5 or 10 years ago were 3 or 4 separate codes in the country. So the IC, the International Code, is now being at least adopted by most states. However, each state has an option to say, I will choose that chapter and not this chapter. So when you're looking at the wiring diagram, you have to go to see where your state is. It may have adopted a section of 2009 version, but it may not have adopted, actually it may not have adopted a version of 2006. So each state is different. The states have generally the authority to determine a state code that is then passed to the locality to adopt it. And it depends on the legal nuance that may exist of whether that local authority has the right to vary that, but it very rarely has the right to lower the standard. And as mentioned, I think in an earlier discussion, if it, in some cases, wishes to make the standard higher, it needs a special exemption and statement of law from the state authorities. Complicated wiring diagram. I show zoning because when you get to talk about resilience, there is as much action and as much regulation and as much standards represented in the zoning. So when you want to figure out why this was built there and why that was allowed there, you actually go to the zoning. This shows different zoning responsibilities. I'm not going to go through this except that the image on the upper right says that most of this is to find out whether this tire fits there, and if it doesn't, is there another part that fits? It's a little bit of mix and match. Actually, it's a lot of mix and match. And if you get the machine to run right, well, that's good, but it often is an exception. And I'm wondering how many are here. If you wish, and I think we need to explain this to all of our community spark plugs, because if you wish to address your local zoning and you have an issue with that proposal or this proposal, in order for you actually to be informed and to advise even your elected officials, you need to know this stuff. And Jim gave a nice briefing to this, so I don't need to spend time. But if I happen to have a resilience meeting in my community and someone says, what about the trees? What about the river? What about the land? What about the dumps? What about the waste? What, X, Y, Z. We have to go back and find out where in the wiring diagram that is allowed or not allowed. Is there an ordinance that permits it, or is there simply an absence of ordinance that does not permit it? And that can make a difference. So we've heard the message. I don't need to say that zoning codes should be in accord with a comprehensive plan, but once you get codes established, there are zoning ordinances and subdivision plans that carry it down to the exactly what is the width of that street, the sidewalk, the height of the curb. And by the way, the width of the street is a big deal. Normally, if I just go to the fire chief, he's going to say 50 feet is good. And I'll point out X, Y, Z that can we, and part of the discussion that you've heard with smart growth is to reduce the width of streets, but also to increase fire safety by more frequent location of fire hydrants and other, so that you're not reducing fire response, you're actually creating a balance that, if you get agreement of all parties, is a win-win. So I say up in the upper left, are you here? Is anybody involved with this level of discussion? Couple, okay. So because only a couple, I'm not going to dwell. I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm going to save us time. But one of the weak links in the discussion of hazards is the process by which we sit around and say, there is a risk. Now, I've been part of 30, 40, 50 natural hazard mitigation plans in the last year. We're doing them like crazy after Hurricane Sandy in the East Coast, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York. Very often the consultants get together all the right people, but we do the risk assessment in about 2 hours with little sticky dots. And someone says, well, I remember, I think there was wasn't there, and Ed, wasn't there a flood here? So a little sticky dot gets put on a road, and then unfortunately no further verification is done. So that's a little bit like going to the doctor and the doctor says, how are you feeling? I say, okay. Oh, well, that's great. Well, here you are. We'll see you next year. It's a little bit too casual, isn't it? I mean, you wished that he had actually taken your temperature, or, isn't he supposed to? So we don't want to submit our communities to anything other than a very rigorous and a very honest risk assessment process. We know how to do that. It's going to take a little bit more time, but we're going to do it. And one of the judgments that were made, and particularly those in the FEMA program are making, is what is the acceptable level of risk? Now, everyone here knows that a 1 in 100 year is a 1% any particular year. But a lot of people don't understand probabilities, and what that often is best explained is I have a roulette wheel and it has 100 positions, and one is bingo. And I pay my dollar and I have 100 rolls. I have 100 turns. And the first time I don't get bingo, so now I have 99 turns. So my chance of getting bingo actually increase. And if I haven't reached bingo by the 99th turn or the 98th turn, I know I have a 50% chance, don't I? So when you play out that probability, and this is understood by 0.001% of the populace, a 100-year or 1% per year chance actually represents over 70 years of 51% chance of flooding. And over my 30-year mortgage, it represents a 26. So here's your house, here's your mortgage. There's a 25% chance you're going to flood. See you later. For that reason, the standard is too low for flooding, and it is being increased. In a recent White House executive order, the standard for federally funded projects was raised to 500 years. That's on any particular year, a 0.2%. But I wonder if those involved in agreeing that 500%, you realize that that building that we just approved for the 500 year has a 10% chance of flooding in 50 years. Not many people understand that. So that's why I think we're back to where Ed was leading us this morning with, not even 3 feet is enough. And the answer is, I want my health assessed on my particular conditions, with my history, with my location, in conversation, not with one health professional, with many. I need to understand that exactly. And what often happens is, without a disaster experience, I know from nothing. If someone in my family has cancer, in 24 hours, I have become so informed about the whole probability game, I know as much as I need to know to talk to that health professional making judgments on behalf of my family member. The same does occur after a disaster in my community. After a disaster in my community gets into this. How can we get them there ahead of time? How can we, as Albert suggested, do this ahead of time? Who's got the magic answer? I think there are answers. Now, there are certain sources for these assessments that are built into the building code. So when this building was designed, the heating, the lighting, the air conditioning was designed based on a certain code. And in the code is a computer program that measures the accumulated temperature over the last 30, 40, 50 years, depending on the record at the weather station. That represents the past history. So I, engineer that designed this building for the air conditioning, have designed it to provide a certain percentage of comfort. It's designed as 96% comfort given a certain temperature regime outside based on prior data. So when the climate data changes, that air conditioning system may not function, or it may run more than it has to. It may either be inadequate to the load, or it'll be more expensive to run. One of those two options. Now, my heating and ventilating folks say, we have safety factors in, not to worry, don't lose your shirt. We change the heating system, air conditioning system every 30 years anyway. We update it. That's a little bit true. But just be aware of when we permit any building, there's a whole bunch of code assumptions, and just like trying to find out, taking the weak link, I like to find out the weak link. When I get into this data, I go to Tulsa and I say, look, Tulsa, it looks like the projection of both rain and drought and temperature, looks like this is the way it's trending. And actually, if you understand those trends, you have opportunities that you didn't think you had. We can use natural cooling because, in fact, the weather is changing, or we can use passive heating because the weather is changing, or we can use, actually, we have to change the size of all of our rain systems. You know, all of our drainage systems, every engineer knows this, there's several here. And I wrote the book that published the data of rain data by which you design a gutter system, and I have to get to update it because in fact that rain data is changing, so our gutter systems have to be larger. So all that's changing. All of this is represented by professional judgment, by the code process that I explained, wise people sitting around saying, risk, medium risk, very high risk, let us set the standard here. It's a human judgment. And I believe in it because I know in the case of seismic, it's very high. The mean return period is thousands and thousands of years. In wind, it's 125 years, and in fact, the wind codes have been upgraded, so I'm not worried about wind. I remain worried, as we all do, about flood, because that data is so not yet thoroughly vetted, and particularly not understood by the professionals who are using the data to design buildings. Or do you go to the people? If you don't go to the experts, let's go get a vote. And here's a recently published vote. And the Great Lakes region is investing heavily in green infrastructure. So when you want to look for some of the best programs in green infrastructure, you look at the Great Lakes. They have a huge fund that's funding regional. And they went out, and I think this is a combination of 6 cities in the Great Lakes region. 51 of participants said they're not being informed at all or only slightly informed about their local government plans and actions to deal with a particular hazard. Familiar, I'm sure. 12% said they feel very or extremely informed about their local government's plans. Now you see Sue up in the corner there saying extra points for a question here. What do you do with a community where 51% report being not informed and 12% are extremely informed? What do you do? You got it, a ticket, maybe 2 tickets, you got it right away. You put them together in a room. Exactly. All right, so this is time for a little fun. This is an art from my archive. My parents gave it to me. They picked it up in a nightclub where they attended in the Second World War in Boston. And this was a comedian. What to do in case of an air raid. As soon as the bombs start dropping, run like hell. It doesn't matter where, as long as you run. Wear track shoes if possible. If the people in front of you are slow, you won't have any trouble getting over them. It goes on. Take advantage of opportunities accorded when the air raid sirens around you. Warning of attack. If in a bakery, grab some pie. Tavern, grab a bottle. In a movie, grab a blonde. Okay, some of you would like, some of you won't like that. This is 1940s. I'll go on and on. If find an unexploded bomb, always pick it up, shake it like hell. Maybe the firing pin is stuck. If that doesn't work, heave it in the furnace, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so actually, a lot of us in the Second World War were laughing at this because, in fact, on the East Coast, we were worried about incendiary bombs. That was a threat. Those of us who remember that, I think I was about 9. I remember the fear that this created around. So who was the comic on the stage? I'll let you know. So my father went up and got his autograph. So I have a Jimmy Durante autograph on the back of that script. So if any collectors wish to give me a price on that, I'm open. So how are we doing with time here, okay? Give me some guidance here, Katie. Time left? Time left? Patience. Okay. 10 minutes? Okay, good, great. That's enough time. So one of the recent White House executive orders that is now part of every state natural hazard mitigation plan through a FEMA directive is that our natural hazard mitigation plans have to represent best judgment, local input on probable future changing conditions. Okay, so that means that all of that data that I talked about, looking at the way climate is tracking, is now part of our local professional and community discussion. We're now engaged with this discussion in many communities, and it ain't easy. And so, again, we need to get down to brass tacks of how we do it. I list in the back FEMA resources, and these are great. FEMA has a building science division that is absolutely rigorous, and I don't know how they do it. I don't know how they produce the work. I know that after every major disaster, they send out a team, MAT team, mitigation assessment team. I'm sure you've run across them. At least for a professional such as myself, a flood professional, an architect, an engineer, a mitigation officer, these are our textbooks. And most important, and it's usually part of everyone's library who is in this business, are the technical bulletins, because they go into the detail of how I design for dry flood proofing, for wet flood proofing, and particularly the advisories. The advisories are published quickly as soon as new information is made available. So in the Hurricane Sandy advisories, and several of them are cited in the backup literature, there's one that says, following the BFE, the base flood elevation, is not sufficient evidence of designing for flood protection. So that's a headline that is not understood by 99% of the folks in the flood business, but it actually is a FEMA-published guideline that's currently represented not only in advisories, but that's getting fed into their other publications. It came out in an advisory in 2013. And you'll see some others. If those of you who are interested, you can sign up for a daily disaster alert that updates you with this information. And particularly a flood officer, I guess, is part of our natural daily study. So I'm going to just give a few examples. Hurricane Ike, Houston, downtown, and the evidence of gravel and stuff flying off roofs and causing harm had already been documented in prior hurricane disasters, Katrina in particular with New Orleans. Air conditioning units that were 3 and 4 tons traveling several hundred yards, okay? They took A from B, and you can see the maps. Well, there was a sighting in Houston that gravel from nearby roofs fell down the lee side, and that's the back side, that's the wind protected side, and sort of was suspended in air in the way that you see that. It sort of held there, and as it was held, it's sort of fist-sized gravel battered the sides so that 40 floors of the Chase Tower lost all its glazing. Now, since then, gravel roofs have been outlawed, and those in the gravel industry, just like Mr. Thatcher in Boston, said, no fair, you're putting us out of business. And they showed evidence that, you could design a roof with gravel, et cetera, but if you look at the code, if you look at the FEMA regulations, it simply says gravel roofs are out, and that's because of the multiple hazards and multiple forensic evidence that stuff flying off roofs is a hazard. And if any hazard a consultant wishes to earn your fee, the first place you go is the roof, because usually you'll find 80% of the risk, and you've only been in your meeting for 10 minutes, so you'll look really good. That's a little bit how the building science MAT reports work, and it's phenomenal. That is, it gives us the evidence of real life response and how to mitigate for. So finally, I think I can end here. I think this is mainly a message for professionals, but also for municipal staff and municipalities. In the Coastal Construction Manual, which has been developed over 30, 35, even longer years, it represents an enormous resource of knowledge. And I think if you're doing not only coastal flood, but now also applying, and it does apply under the NFIP program, to riverine flooding. So if you're doing riverine flood engineering You also have this text on your, and FEMA has sprayed throughout it like a sticky paper, warning, meeting minimum regulatory and code requirements for the siting, design, and construction of buildings does not guarantee that the building will be safe from all hazard effects. So you've heard that. So meeting the minimum standard, it might be represented in code, but if I, having a license to be an architect engineer, stand up and say I have met minimum code, I have not yet fulfilled the standard of care required of me as a licensed professional. I have to show that I have analyzed all risks. So those of us who are in municipalities, when plans are presented, the professionals so presenting have to represent that they have applied due diligence in meeting the standard of care. They are required by law, by pledge of office, to know this stuff and to have the correct qualified consultants on their team designing for. Well, enough said. I think that, as I said, might be a good place to stop with 2 summary slides. Let's say what codes can do. They establish the legally and technically vetted standards for public health and safety. Those words, public health and safety, should be in every statement made about a building code or a zoning plan. My zoning plan, my development proposal meets the standard of care for public health and safety in this way because it's established by code, subject to forensic evidence, as I discussed, updated every 3 years by ICC, and it applies to minimum standards. I found in Florida, in Miami, a booming town, going crazy for all the wrong reasons, if you ask me, but the developer said, if it's part of the code, I'm happy with it. Just make it part of the code. We want a level playing field. So if you have a wish list, get it into the codes because it does provide a level playing field for the game called development. And that's out of fairness. And most important for innovation. You've heard the term innovation. It's a great term, particularly in industry. Opportunity for the building industry to get competitive advantage by being innovative. Setting high codes and standards in the codes creates an industry benchmark for worldwide for products that meet a worldwide market. And that's a national economic opportunity. So when you give me blowback about codes, I'm telling you that the good codes are the way to succeed by high performance in our businesses. What codes cannot do, they do not define the higher than minimum standards. They can be inconsistent and incompatible, varying by states and localities. That's very typical right now. And then, even if I've met all the codes, I still haven't fully met the public health and safety, which may be contingent upon other than building site. That is, my public health and safety in my community ain't just dependent on how well I fulfilled the local building and site conditions. So with that, I dare not take you longer, except to encourage you to look at the rest of the references, and I hope, Katie, I'm completing this discussion in time.
Okay, so I don't have to speak up. 2 things. One, I noticed in your presentation and also in future slides, you mentioned the Fortified Home Program.
Yes.
We do have 2 representatives from IBHS, very familiar with the Fortified Home Program.
So they are. So here you go, and thank you, Tim, because you guys are doing great work. So this is great fun, and this was not knowing you were coming. I wanted to have the audience know about your wonderful video. So Flash has supported everything I just said. So Flash has a report. Disaster resilience means the time is right. This report supports the case I just presented. And the fortified home building, I can give you some, but you can see this on the web and video, okay? And look at this last one. You guys, whoops, maybe I've lost it. Okay. There you are. So am I right? Here, you guys are going to correct me. I interpreted your website data saying that the added cost of building fortified on the right and the one that just went downwind is a $1,500 investment. Is that more or less good enough?
You are correct in that the structural improvements of the straps and some of the other things that were done there to make the structure more resilient cost about $1,500. All told, there were some other upgrades in the quality of the siding, the roof covering material, and some others. So the total cost increase was about $3,000.
Okay.
The structural upgrades were about $1,500.
Thank you. And nice going. Thank you, Tim.
I missed getting on the treadmill this morning, so I'm happy for this.
I appreciated your piece earlier with the urban heat island and similar related issues. At APA back 6 years ago, so 2009, we produced actually a report on planning the urban forest in which we laid out all of these benefits of the urban forest for mitigating
Yes.
urban heat island, filtering air pollution, managing stormwater runoff. There's a whole host of corollary benefits that actually, basically we were trying to pitch repositioning trees as not a cost center or a luxury, but a strategic investment. I think there's a lot of lessons to be had in reorienting our thinking about the urban forest in that direction in connection with some of these problems.
So that, and thank you for letting me show a few more slides here. Green infrastructure, the key word in green infrastructure is connections. A lot of our projects are bits and pieces. I do this there, I do that there. I think in Tulsa you have actually an urban network. So water not just only sits and gets absorbed, it gets connected to creating all these other benefits. And then I have an answer to what is the most important tree. Here's a little, forgive me for going a little bit over. This is what do I do with all this water? Here is an ingenious solution that's been implemented on the campus of University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where they've defined their campus as a zero discharge zone. Now, you mentioned that that's in discussion here. It is possible, and it actually is more economical than providing the total storm discharge system. So that's been proved. There's enough research data that says A, B, and zero discharge can show, we have to show and convince our developers can be implemented at less cost than a full sewer discharge or a stormwater discharge system. So just take a look at this. It's a rainstorm, and see if you can figure out what's happening. Okay, that cistern over here in the middle has gotten filled up, and now it's flowing. You can see it flowing off the roofs. All of the roofs go into this system, and then it fills up the second silo. So silo on the left is silo 1. It gets filled up, and then through an underground pipe, you see it in the middle. That's the first, silo 1. And this was an experiment I remember doing as an 8-year-old. I had 2 Coke bottles, and you would jiggle them and figure out why the water was as high on one as the other. And there it is. So they have doubled the water storage capacity on this small site, figure out a way to fill the tanks. Any spillover gets put into the green infrastructure park there, gets filtered in, and I have water now left over for landscape. So that's one of the many best practices that I hope are convincing that this is a way to go. Thank you, Jim. And by the way, your reference is in my pile, so I got a couple here.
So here's my follow-up question on all of this. I love what you've got here. I love the low-impact development, green infrastructure, fortified home. One of my frustrations over the years has been there are multiple standards by different groups, kind of stovepipe, not crossing over, and there's no one place that I could send someone to get a comprehensive view of how all of this could work together to make a community better. Is there such a place where we can find all these standards put into a single place? Do you know of anybody that's working on doing that?
Well, I know that I'm working on it. For those of you who know and go to my website, I'm the editor of big fat books that are about 1,000 pages thick, and they are produced for the architectural profession, the so-called Book of Knowledge. And in any particular volume, I'm working with 80 or 100 experts. And we're now compiling that stuff, but it does take us several years. That's point one. The other point is I get up, I won't tell you how early in the morning, and I start looking at what came in overnight. And there's 4 or 5 new stuff every day. It's the rate of knowledge and the rate of parties engaged. And I have at the end, it's my last slide, and I'm not going to show it, slides over, a document called OARS, the OARS list, Organizations Addressing Resilience and Sustainability. It's free, downloadable if you want it. If you don't have it, it's on the NMH site. It's on many sites. And I update it every month, and I add about 40 citations every month. It's extraordinary, the rate of growth, and sometimes that means more existing organizations are jumping in, and in other cases, new organizations are starting up, and they'll shake out. There's duplication, but it's a wonderful, it actually is a wonderful engagement of topic to see that this is actually a worldwide discussion, and nothing is as important as this discussion to us and our future generations. So I had one slide that is important to me, and it's this one. The takeaway message is, for all our work, we do not yet know the upper limit of our capacity to build a resilient future, and you now know the most important tree in Oklahoma. Thank you.